Hello, good morning. I don't know what time it is. I got to be honest with you because uh, my new computer with this terrible camera that makes me look all washed out. I'm getting a new camera soon. Says it's 11:02, and my phone says it's 10:59. And I trust my phone more than I trust my camera. Is that the right thing to do? I don't know. Hi Betsy. Hi Lisa. Hi Lisa. Good to see all three of you. Kathy Baggett's coming along here too. Anybody else we might have joining us? How's everybody doing today? Everybody good? Can you see me and hear me, etc.? I hope. I don't know. I guess we'll find out. All right. What are we going to talk about today? I did not get any questions ahead of time, so I'm hoping y'all have some questions. Oh, Lisa did ask me a question about the destruction of the temple. I'm not sure what you want me to tell you about it, though. I'm not sure what you'd like to know about the destruction of the temple, or which temple when it was destroyed, because the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed twice, right? So once by Babylon and once by Rome. Which, yeah, this is true. World is heavy, but the day is good. I agree, Lisa Clemens. The world is heavy. The day is good. Yesterday was great. How about that Supreme Court decision? I was psyched. That was pretty awesome. That was one of those that was a great way to start a Monday, right? So the temple was destroyed twice, both during sieges of Jerusalem. One was by Babylon, and there's a lot we have in the Old Testament around that Babylonian siege, and then the exile of Israel after the destruction of the temple, and then so much of the language of like Second Isaiah and some of the other exilic or post-exilic prophets are around the building of the second temple. And we even have two books, Ezra and Nehemiah, which are talking about the building of the second temple, which was the temple in existence when Jesus was present in Jerusalem. That was the one that he stood in front of or went inside of, was the temple, was the second temple. So that first temple was destroyed when Babylon overtook Jerusalem and Israel. The second one, the Jews revolted against Roman rule in the 40s, I think, or maybe the 60s. I think it was just for the 60s, and in the 60s, and I think they basically had control of Jerusalem. They'd kicked out Rome for like 4 years, and Rome besieged Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and killed just a lot of people, and that was and scattered the Jews. And that was the end of the temple era. That was the end, for all intents and purposes, of a temple sacrifice in Jewish tradition. There has not been another temple rebuilt. And what's really fascinating is both temples loom large over a lot of the conversations. Both of those events loom large over a lot of the themes and a lot of the things that are going on in our Old and New Testament. Because in the Old Testament, a lot of that, the scriptures that had been, the stories that had been told were put into scripture form, put into the writing form for the first time during the Babylonian exile. And so and Betsy, we talked about this in our Genesis Bible study, but we think about Genesis as being way over here. My hands are so washed out with this camera, like they disappear in the light, right? But you think about Genesis being way over here, and then Isaiah or the prophets being way over here. But and surely the stories from Genesis were told for many, many years before they were written down. But imagine them being written down for the first time at about the same time. That's what's interesting, is the stories of Genesis and Exodus become the written stories that we have during that time of exile and in the aftermath of the destruction of the temple. So this temple, as the symbol of God's dwelling place and the presence, the presence of God, right? God is present here, and this is the promise fulfilled. Israel has its land. Israel has its temple. Israel has its king. Israel has a name. So when we look at the promise, the covenant to Abraham, we're seeing it fulfilled, and that all gets destroyed. And so you can imagine the great trauma, the absolute devastating trauma of that first destruction of the temple. And it looms large over the writings in the heart of that Old Testament. And so then there's this building of this new temple, which has there's a lot of messianic overtones to that. And a lot of people think that when, like in 2nd Isaiah, when he's talking about a messianic figure, he's talking about someone who actually enables the building of the second temple. Some people kind of go that direction with it. So the second temple is a huge deal. It's the reaffirmation. It's this thing's going to stand forever. Like we have gone into exile, but we've come back. We've got this, right? And so you can imagine that story of Exodus being present during this Babylonian exile and then being brought back, and then the reaffirmation, the rebuilding of who the people of Israel are. And then Jesus dies in, depending on your clock, somewhere between 33 and 37 AD, right? Something like that. And then 35 years later, the temple's destroyed. Well, most of the New Testament writings that we have were written either probably right before or right after that, but a lot of them after. And so there's that like tension and that devastation again, that trauma. Mom's upstairs. Go talk to mom. There's that trauma that is present in the text again, even if it's only obliquely referred to. This idea of again, the striving and the struggling for Israel to be an independent people, for the Jews to be autonomous and led by God and not by Rome or by Babylon or anyone else, to have their land, to have their place, to have something they can call safe and home, and that's a fulfillment of the promise, and is and has a place where they can enact the worship that is in their scriptures, so they can fulfill the all of that, right? To have that be built and then to have it destroyed again. So you see this played out in a lot of places. You see it played out in the gospel readings, with the gospel writings, which Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple, foretells the destruction of the temple. And some people think that, well, it was written after the fact and he didn't really predict it, blah, 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 blah. I'm not going to get into that. The stories contain a clear notion that this is, this looms large over the New Testament. There's this whole thing. Well, I mean, like talk about poor exegesis, like biblical interpretation, like Revelation being used as this crystal ball future predictor. But Revelation keeps talking about Babylon. Who's the whore of Babylon and great Babylon, the great city? Blah, blah. Who's it talking about? I mean, it's talking about Rome, right? Because that's what they've experienced. Rome acting like Babylon, enslaving and oppressing them, destroying their temple, laying siege to what matters to them. And then you have all this language about spiritualizing the temple and spiritualizing the sacrifice. So it's the language is in the New Testament is profoundly affected by the temple and by the occupation of Rome. And the language and the themes of the Old Testament are profoundly influenced by the temple and by the oppression and the enslavement from Babylon. And you have those dueling sort of empires. So you'll hear a lot in modern context talking about empire, and oftentimes America referred to as an empire. And I think sometimes that language can be used sort of like shorthandedly and very like dismissively, but it's important that we understand when we talk about empire, because I have grown up, I don't know about you, but I never thought of our country as an empire, right? That wasn't the way that I thought about us. And to some degree, I still don't think of us as an empire the way that the Roman Empire worked, or the way that the English, the British Empire worked. Like, I don't think we've ever tried it that way in my thoughts. But the idea of empire as an external and an oppressive worldly force that privileges might makes right sort of thinking, and allows for extreme inequity, and maybe even not just allows for it, but thrives in some ways off of extreme inequity. Um, that inequity is. Oh, I'm going to do a little wordplay. Ready? I'm not even going to try to be clever about it. Like, this is just super wordplay, but like inequity, meaning what, a lack of equality, and iniquity, which is this historic word of sinfulness. Like, to God, they're the same. Like, our choice to live in inequity is iniquitous. It is sinful. It is our willingness to live like that. And so in our desire to sort of decide we know what's best as a people, and then sort of export that, so to speak. Also things like maintaining peace by always being at war. This was the Pax Romana, right? So understanding this, sometimes the language is so polemical, it can get us turned off of being honest and repenting and thinking about ourselves. It also can sound like we hate ourselves, or like we're saying, I don't know, it can just be very unproductive. But I think when we talk about understanding America as empire, what we're really trying to do, I hope, is examining the places where our country is mimicking the behavior of these other world powers, where life was not at their center, right? Life, real life, which is God's life, right? Not just living as long as possible for a few people, but life. There was a phenomenal sermon this Sunday at the National Cathedral by William Barber, who, if you don't know who he is, check him out. He's the co-director of the Poor People's Campaign, and a spiritual, just a spiritual giant, genuinely, like, brilliant. And his sermon at the National Cathedral, and he talks about this a lot, that to choose inequity, to choose unjust ways of living and structures that aren't interested in equality and the dignity of every human being, to choose that is to choose death. That's death. And to choose justice is to choose life, right? Justice is to choose life, right? Are there any good examples of protest in the Bible? Sure, but they always get people killed. Jesus, I mean, overturning the tables in the temple, that example gets overused, like, by people who are like, see, it's fine. It's a moment that's real, and it's in all four Gospels, and in not in John, but in the other three Gospels, it's the event that finally, like, pushes the Jewish authorities to say, we got to do something about this guy, right? Like, this is we got to do something about this. So that's a big deal, and that's a protest. But sustained protest, the way we think about it now, no, not that I can think of. I mean, you can find things like Ezekiel's great, because Ezekiel uses his body as a living embodiment of protest, and his prophecies are played out in things that he does with his body, which are protests against his own government. So you can check out Ezekiel for that. And in some ways, the prophetic preaching, the oracle nature, the oracular nature of the prophets, I mean, in some ways, their prophecies are protests, sustained and literary verbal protests against the injustice of the country that they love, right? John the Baptist is a protester. It's not his primary vocation, but it's one of them. His primary vocation is to proclaim the coming of the Messiah, to be the embodiment of Elijah, of the second Elijah, right? But and this is really interesting, right? So the protests that occur in scriptures, they don't happen for protest's sake. they are what happens when these people who are faithful to God recognize that the society that to which they belong, in which they are complicit, in which they are a part, is not actually living into the promise for which they were made, and is not living into its part of the covenant with God, right? So the protest emerges from that place of something's got to be said, right? And that's what we see today, I think, and it's really similar. What are these protests about? Now, the way that we are experiencing protests today, which is mostly marching and signs and chants, with some people speaking, mostly. I mean, we live in a country where we've made a point of saying that's allowed. The right of the people peaceably to assemble is not actually something that was guaranteed at all in Rome or even Israel. That idea that we have a right to do this is relatively new in human history. So we're experiencing it in a really interesting way. Yeah. There's something else I was going to say about that. I'm interested. Someone said something to me. Oh, two things I want to talk about in this sort of connected to this, right? So, Kathy Baggett says that Palm Sunday is a protest. Well done, you. That's a phenomenal point. Like, genuinely a phenomenal point. It's to see this guy come and to treat him like a king publicly, to make the public sort of act that you would make if Caesar or an emissary of Caesar showed up, and then to refer to him as Messiah, is a political act. Very well said, right? And when you read Luke, Luke's the one where the authorities say to Jesus, like, you got to stop these people. And Jesus is like, if they don't talk, if they are quiet, then the stones themselves will shout out, which is Luke really wants us to understand the cosmos is yearning for Christ. The whole of creation. Jesus is present to bring about this deliverance, not just to one body, but to the whole of creation. And so that's where that comes from. This idea of inequity, of inequality, I have not, I'm still trying to figure my own beliefs out, to be super clear, when it comes to economics and it comes to economic systems. I'm kind of a mess. So just FYI. I mean, just in general, I'm kind of a mess. If you don't know that by now, here we are. But when it comes to this, I surely am. I have historically not had a problem with inequality, and that's probably because I've always been on the right side of it. And so it's not been my problem. And when I've been poor, personally, which I have been personally, I also knew that if something happened, I knew where I could go and stay. I had numbers of places, of families that would never have let me. I mean, and I had a facility for. I had degrees and I had connections and I had this and that. So even if my bank account was really low, and that's happened to me several times in my life as an adult, I don't pretend that I've experienced inequality on any. I mean, I've had a life of great privilege. It's just true. But I didn't always understand, like, what's the problem. And then someone asked me a question. A friend of mine, a family member who's Roman Catholic, was asking. I guess the Pope had Francis had said something about was preaching against inequality, financial inequality. And this person messaged me and was like, "Do you really think that this is, like, should Christians be against financial inequality, economic disparity?" And I was like, "Oh, Well, because I'm a terrible person, my first thought was like, I don't think so. And then I started thinking about it, and I realized our prayer as Christians is thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven, right? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. The Christian's prayer to God is that the earth where we are now would look more like heaven every day and feel like and be experienced like heaven. That's the goal. And then the Christian responsibility when we say amen is to get up off our knees, open our eyes, open our hands, and participate with God, roll up our sleeves and participate with God in the work of bringing God's kingdom to bear in the world, right? So if we're praying daily the prayer Jesus taught us, and we're saying, "Thy kingdom come, Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven," and then we are empowered as the church by the Holy Spirit, and we talked about this last week, but it can never be said enough that as the church, as baptized Christians, we have been incorporated into the body of Christ, and by the power of the Holy Spirit are literally given the breath of life, the spirit, the inspiration and the power to then go embody Christ in the world. We are participating with God in the making of the kingdom to come and the will of God to be done on earth as it is in heaven. And then it's just a simple question: are there poor people in heaven? Is there income? Are there rich people and poor people? Is there wealth disparity in heaven? Are there people who don't have in heaven? Lisa says, don't we see it everywhere among churches, even among Episcopal churches? Some with great wealth and resources and ability to do ministry have had nice things. Many other churches have little. It's true. It's true. And what would an even distribution of that look like? How would we do that? How would that affect? It would affect Redeemer. It would affect our church because we're a church with an endowment. We're a church with people who give very well to the church, and we have a pretty big budget, right? So we can do cool things because of that. We have great resources, and it's beautiful. But what would it look like? I'm not actually when we do share, Lisa. I mean, Redeemer gives over $200,000 a year to the diocese. That's sharing. So we do absolutely share. And that is important for us to know that one of the ways that the Episcopal Church is structured is that churches like ours give, and we give a ton to the diocesan body, which is then distributed for ministry and mission within the diocese. And that is and it is literally called our share of our mission share. So that is something we do, and it's an important part of the work. I'm fine with that. Some people go, well, we give how much? And I'm like, man, we give what they ask us to give, and let's raise more so we can give more. You know what I mean? I think it's a beautiful thing. I want to make sure. I'm hoping that the diocese does good things with it, right? And so you hope for a robust and healthy diocese that's thinking evangelistically, is thinking in terms of justice, and making sure that certain places can exist that would not be able to. That are doing vital and important work in a certain community, but that community can never support the work that it was doing financially. Like, you want to see that stuff happen, right? Not advocating for communism, for the record. I feel like I have to say that. I'm not a commie. I'm not a commie. But, there's no but, I'm not. Okay? That hasn't worked out well for people. There's the Marxist theory requires violence and doesn't acknowledge God's presence. And I think that's something that we need to pay attention to. But if we are thinking about God's kingdom coming and God's will being done, and then we start to ask the question, what does it look like when we, as Christians, participate in that? How do we do that? How do we make decisions that we believe will bring this country more in line, or our communities, or even just our churches, more in line with the way God sees us? And we have to do that in a country that is not a theocracy, that actually guarantees a freedom of religion and is a representative democracy. And we're going to have to play within those rules. So then what does that look like, right? But the main thing that keeps pecking away at me in my previous understanding of things is, are there rich people and poor people in heaven? Is there wealth disparity in heaven? And are people on the margins of heaven? Even if there were, like, to put it as crudely as possible, like someone who has a palace in heaven and someone who has a shack, like, first of all, that's not the way I think of any of that. But like, even saying it sounds ridiculous. But the idea that there would be people who literally don't have access to healthcare, the idea that there are people living on the streets at all in our country, that we not only allow it, but we just kind of go, yeah, well, that's part of the deal, that we accept it as a reality. And I know it's been a reality in the history of the world, but the history of the world's also had to deal with starvation and things and famine in ways that we've essentially said, we don't experience famine in this country. Why do we even have margins? Why does the wealthiest country in the history of the world have poverty at all? Like, why? That doesn't make any sense, right? So I'm not advocating for communism or something like that. I'm really not. I'm saying, like, how do Christians, what can we do? What does that look like? What does that look like? And how do we do that work? Some of the protests we're seeing right now, that's what they're really about, right? Is equity in terms of how bodies are treated, how people are treated, what the justice system looks like for people of color versus white people. Like, why is it different? Why are those disparities there? That working on that, like creating equity in that space is essential, right? That's Christian work. To if there is a disparity in the justice system in terms of how people are dealt with, based on the color of their skin, then the Christian's got to step in and be a part of the change. And if there's an inequity in the justice system in how people are treated if they're rich or poor, then the church has to step in and be part of the change. Have to. It's not optional. It's not an option. That's the work, right? So anyways, this is part of the deal. So Lisa Grubb says, because for sometimes I wish we'd sacrifice things for others. Sometimes we could do less for a bit so others could benefit. Definitely. Then you say, because for me, Jesus is always in the trenches with the poor. Yes, and we read a book at Redeemer this past year called Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. And Howard Thurman makes a really important point. It's not just that Jesus is in the trenches with the poor. It's that Jesus is poor. It's not just solidarity, although there is solidarity in the traditional sense. It's Jesus is one of them. Jesus shows up. When God shows up in Jesus Christ, God shows up in the marginalized person, not just among them, as one. And that's a really important distinction. That Jesus is, a homeless itinerant worker and a Jew in Roman occupation. Jesus is a marginalized person and a poor person. Jesus is not someone who comes and visits. Jesus exists as that. So how do we change that? How do we change our understanding, that is, of Jesus as simply one who's sort of likes poor people? Although some people don't even think that, right? Like, for some, they're like, they don't even think that the poor are loved, the way we treat them, we ignore them as a society. But it's not just that Jesus loves poor people too. It's that Jesus is poor. It's not just that Jesus loves the people on the margins. It's that Jesus is on the margins. And he's not just visiting. That's where his home is, right? There's a fundamental difference there that we've got to grapple with. I've heard, when I've heard people say, like, the job of the church is to take care of the poor, I actually get really uncomfortable, because the suggestion there is the church isn't poor, and that the church is a gathering of well-resourced people whose job it is to help people with less resources, rather than a community that incorporates people, both rich and poor, into itself and lives as a body, one body, in a way that crushes those inequities and those economic and sociological differences. That's a profound difference, right? It's not the job of the church to be well-resourced people taking care of poor people. That's the job of the church, is to recognize to recognize the fullness of God's presence in people, rich and poor, but especially in the poor, and to then incorporate people across those boundaries into one community that's unified. Not a rich church and a poor church, right? Not segregated by race or by socioeconomic status, but churches that are poor and rich, black and white together, and then living a shared life and seeing how that transforms them. That's the thing, right? But yes, Lisa, I don't think we can be the church without active commitment to equality and the dignity of all others. And for me, that involves sacrifice. It does. It will involve sacrifice. And in some ways it involves sacrifice for all people in different ways. But the love that we experience and the love that we undertake in the church is sacrificial by definition. And for folks like you and I who have more, that sacrifice should take on financial attributes. How could it not? It's got to, right? It's got to. Lisa Clemens said something that I think is really important here, right? Why are many of us taught not to see those margins? And I think it's fear. We're afraid of becoming what we see on the margins, right? So you may have heard me say this before, but it's worth saying over and over again, in my opinion. Hey guys, hey Reed. We're just kidding. But you don't need to be in here. Just go, okay? You guys go. Go on. Thank you. They will find a way. They'll be back. There's not a chance they won't be back. It's really common to see somebody suffering or living on the margins or making bad decisions or being the product of blah, 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 and then saying, there, but for the grace of God, go I. And that seems like this really humble statement that I'm only been spared from that by the grace of God. So Tom Long, who's a Presbyterian pastor, professor, and preacher, wrote a commentary on the letter to the Hebrews, on that book of the Bible. And in his commentary, he talks about Jesus, as one of the disinherited, as one of the marginalized, as one of the poor. And he says, because of Jesus, the Christian can no longer say, there, but for the grace of God, go I. Because of the way that Jesus existed in the world. He still exists, but the particular way he existed as Jesus of Nazareth in the world. Because of that, we can no longer say, there, but for the grace of God, go I. Now we have to say, there, because of the grace of God, goes God. That when we look on the margins, that's where God is, but we're scared. Think of what it would require of you to believe that. Think about how we would have to change our lives if God is on the margins of society. What would be required of you, of me? I preached on this on Pentecost, but essentially the um, the Holy Spirit rushes on to the apostles and lights them up and empowers them to be church in this miraculous moment where they're telling the truth about Jesus to people of all different languages. They're speaking in the native tongue of others, even though that isn't their language. This is the work that the Holy Spirit does and begins the spreading out, the pushing them out into the world to let the whole world know the truth of God's love. And there are people present who see it, and they say, oh, they must be drunk. They must be drunk. And why? Why would they say that? You see a bunch of people miraculously speaking in other languages, and clearly they're doing it. It's not fake. And they've got tongues of fire above their head after this rushing, furious wind happens, tongues of fire, and then speaking different languages, and you go, they must be drunk. What is that? That is denial, because to accept the truth of what's happening would require us to change things about it. If the people in that space who'd said they must be drunk were honest about what they saw and embraced it and accepted it, it would require them to admit something is true about Jesus, which would require some of them to acknowledge wrongdoing, acknowledge their sins, acknowledge that some of the people that were there were the ones who put Jesus to death, how they would have to live differently if that's true, if it's true about Jesus, and what it would say about decisions they'd made and about how they had lived. That's painful, right? So we have people today who will not acknowledge those on the margins because we're scared of what it would mean for us. We're scared. We're not. We say we're scared for our safety. That's not it. We're not. We're scared of what it would mean about us. We're scared of becoming radicals. We're scared of being embarrassing to people we know. We're scared of looking like we're crazy by not accepting this status quo as acceptable, as the way it should be. We're scared of it. And the people on the margins aren't attractive to us. We are conditioned to see them as unattractive. And because we live in a society that allows for margins and treats people with inequity, the people on the margins need help and are sick and oftentimes are not well mentally or emotionally or physically. Oftentimes it's not fun. It's not exciting. It's not it's not pretty. And so I'm not trying to, and that's the tricky thing, to really be honest about people in the margins and to find Jesus there and to care for them is not to idealize them, because idealizing people is just as dehumanizing as ignoring them. Ignoring people is dehumanizing, but idealizing them is also dehumanizing, right? It's the person who responds to what they see as racism by saying, "Oh no, I think all black people are great. I love black people. In fact, here's the things I love about black people." Whoa, 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 right? Let's to flatten that out and to idealize is not actually what creates equity and acknowledges the dignity of every human being. That will take work. Lisa says, hanging out on the margins is absolutely the best thing ever. Every time that I have been involved with work with people experiencing homelessness or on the margins of our society, it has been amazing. It has also been challenging. It also reminds us that I was doing this thing called Laundry Love back in California, where we'd take over a laundromat once a week and pay for people to do their laundry who needed it. And we would do that once a month rather. And people would show up and we'd pay for their lawn, and we'd pay for their laundry. We'd have all the detergent and fabric softener and stuff, and hang out with people. And that was it. I've been part of a couple churches that have done this work, and it's awesome. Every time, friendships are made, lives are changed, unquestionably. And I remember one time I was doing it, and I had to go home. I had to take my kids home. It was bedtime, but we were still going, but I had to go. And this one guy looked at me and he's like, he was not at all grateful to me, at least not outwardly. He was not at all nice to me, at least not outwardly. And he said, that's the thing, you get to go home, but this is where I live. And he was right. I got to go home to my little 3-bedroom townhouse, right, with my flat screen TV and my comfortable bed. And so I was, I was convicted that night, and I've been really comfortable in Cincinnati. I'm part of a church. We're part of a church that does a lot of really good work. I'm really proud of the work that Redeemer does and has set up for itself in terms of its engagement with people living on the margins of society, and particularly around issues of homelessness. But like, I have not, other than managing the organization that allows for it, that does it, I don't have a lot of skin in the game right now. It's yeah, any comparison I make to anything else is just crude. It's an area of my life that I've got to change, because it's easy to get out of practice. And it's because it's easy to go back to sleep. It's easy to be comforting and to live in the comfort. And part of the beauty of the work of the on the ground justice work on the margins, not just structural stuff, but you with your body, taking that body to a place on the margins and working with people there as people, person to person, it transforms everybody involved. And it's also like, I'm not always ready for that transformation. And I have the privilege to hold it off. I got to change that, man. I got to work on that. That's got to change. It's got to change. Yeah. How can we respond with love? Lisa asks. First of all, Lisa Clemens, thank you. Just already. This is what I want to write about for my blog for tomorrow. And I've got work to do to get it there, but how can we respond with love to people who would ignore others? There's been a quote going around a lot lately, and I'm always hesitant. On one hand, white people should lift up Black voices and point to them. And on the other hand, white people don't want to just constantly reappropriate and say, oh, this is ours. But I've pretty much fallen in love with James Baldwin in the last 6 months. A year, maybe. No, not 6 months, I guess. No, a year, because I started reading him last summer. That's right. I started reading him last summer. And James Baldwin has a line. He's talking about being an artist. And he says, being an artist is sort of, in society, being an artist is sort of like being a lover. Because if I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you do not see. Now, we don't want to get into a love relationship with others where we think it's our job always to fix them or find what's wrong with them. But there is something loving that needs to be done when people choose to ignore. There's loving work that we can do in terms of talking with them. I guess what I would say is I can't micromanage how we talk to each other, and I wouldn't have the exact words you would want to say to that person. What I would say is, how do we interact with people who make a rule of ignoring inequity, make a rule of ignoring the bare fact of white supremacy and the existence of a systemic racist system and things like that, like systemic racism and racial injustice. How do we, when people would choose to ignore that, I guess I would say interact with them as you have the energy so to do, with the understanding that when it's all over, you're going to be together. What does it look like to interact with someone with not only the understanding, but the desire that you all be reconciled to one another at some point? And that should mitigate the way that you interact. That should influence the way that you interact. Not as a way of going easy on them and letting them, say whatever they want, but also don't create relationships or pursue a relationship where someone where you feel like your whole job is to fix, right? Like if when people become projects and not people, we get lost, right? We get lost, and so we've got, and that's a constant struggle, because on one hand you don't want to just turn a blind eye when someone is being destructive to themselves or others, and on the other hand uh, you don't want to make your life about thinking other people are projects. So for instance, if you think your job in interacting with people experiencing homelessness is to fix them, then you don't understand what Jesus is asking you to do. Can you hear my kid screaming in the background? Is that my kid? He's a screamer. Might be our neighbor though. We got a couple of screamers on this block. You get frustrated, as you said, but venting frustration won't help coming from a place of hurt, but finding words coming from love is hard. It is. And honestly, realizing where it's safe to vent, right? So you can vent to me. I'm your priest. Maybe not here on YouTube Live, but you can always call me or message me and vent that way, or you can vent to Liz. You can vent to your wife. But where do you vent? So having those safe spaces to vent your frustration, and then acknowledge that sometimes we need to take a step back from certain relationships, not out of hatred, not because we don't care, but because we need to protect ourselves to a certain degree and get ourselves to a place of strength so that we can re-engage in love. And we've got to understand that love has boundaries. Not that love has an end. Not that love is finite, because it's not. But God, throughout the narrative of the Bible, most obviously in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament as well, God sets up clear boundaries saying, I'm God and you're not. And there's places you don't get to go. And what's God doing there? We've read that and we're like, how dare God do that? But what's God actually doing? God is setting up healthy boundaries, because all relationships of love have healthy boundaries. God will invite you into relationship, and God will be present in that relationship and active in that relationship with you. And it will be a relationship of mutuality, but it will not be a codependent relationship where the boundaries between the two of you dissolve and you don't know who's who and what's what. That's not part of the deal. God's still God, and you and I are not. And that distinction matters. It's a model for healthy love relationship, that God would set up natural and healthy boundaries. You don't get to be abusive to God and then go, but your love is unconditional, so what's the problem? That's abuse, right? So God creates boundaries and has responses that are real to our decision to be abusive to God. God's forgiveness is real, but it's not a forgiveness that just like, it's not, God's not a concept. God's a living reality with a personality. You don't get to just decide how God would feel about something. And God's not just an inanimate or unsentient force, right? It's not an it, right? God's a they or a he or a she. God's God. And so the relationship we have with God, it has to have boundaries, and and then the relationships we have here on earth, if we want to understand healthy love, look to the way we are meant to interact with God, with mutuality and respect and fidelity to one another and integrity, but also respecting the definition, respecting and understanding that each of us has boundaries. So if you're in a relationship, a friendship with someone, or a family ship with someone who is ignoring these things and you don't know how to deal with them, there's sometimes it's only so much you can do. You can't fix them. Maybe you tell them what you need to tell them once and they've heard you say it. And then maybe you need to set up boundaries. Hey, don't say those things in front of me. I won't have it. You don't need to try to fix them every time or change their mind. I wish you wouldn't think this way. But you can have that conversation once and then you've had it. But then you got to allow people to be themselves, even if they're wrong. And then if they choose to live that way, in a way that continues to erode your understanding of your interactions with them, and be corrosive to your heart, then you might need to step back for the sake of love. I'm going to take a step back because I love you, and I'm concerned that if I stay in this space of abuse or misunderstanding, constant and possibly willful misunderstanding, I'm concerned that I won't be loving. I won't be able to see Christ in you, seek and serve Christ in all people, loving your neighbor as yourself, and recognizing the dignity of every human being, right? That's part of our baptismal covenant. So that's the work, right? I guess, Lisa Grubbs, when you say in the margin is where I always find Jesus, so much more than at church, I assume you're meaning in a church building during a worship service. It would be my hope that we're able to see God in both places, that we can find Jesus present in different ways, in different places. It would also be my hope that we would not, that church would not just be a social club. But would be a community of love that incorporates people from across these diverse understandings of the way to be in the world, and diverse experiences, and diversity of race, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic situation, and political persuasion. That would be the hope. Not just the hope, that's what we are trying to build. And just like when God and Moses are up on the top of the mountain, carving away at the 10 Commandments or whatever, and the people are down in the valley making a golden calf and reveling and doing all sorts of unspeakable acts, God goes, hey, let's trash the whole thing. Leave me alone, God says to Moses, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I'll destroy them, blot them out, and start all over just with you. That's an important moment because it reminds us that sense of wrathful regret and a wondering of how this is supposed to work is a divine moment, that we're not separated from God even in our disillusionment, that God has space for disillusionment, which means being disillusioned from time to time is not sinful inherently. But in that moment, God, think about what Lisa Clemens just said about having, venting and what that looks like. God has a place to vent, which is Moses. God, the beautiful thing about God, one of the many beautiful things, but the thing that I love in that story is God has set himself up in relationship with Moses, such that when God needs to be, when God experiences disillusionment, God has a safe place to take that. God doesn't inflict that upon the world, and God doesn't just decide to burn it all to cinders and start again. Moses goes, whoa, hold on. That's not how this is going to go. It's a beautiful moment. It's a beautiful moment, and I think either overlooked or misunderstood a lot of the time, because I see it as the acknowledgement of the divine presence, even in our disillusionment, but also in the, well, I don't, well, I'm not going to be part of a church because I don't see God there. Like, well, God's there. And maybe it would be fun to burn the whole thing to the ground and start from scratch with a whole new church, but you'd end up with a lot of the same issues because we're people. So and that doesn't mean that every church is right for every person. I mean, maybe it's a matter of finding the right place for you, right? I get that. My place is Redeemer. And so for me, I love the people who are there for they are, not for who I want them to be. Say that again, right? How do I love the people there, not for who they are, or not for who I want them to be, but for who they are, right? How do I love people for who they are? How do I love the community for what it is? And how do I participate with them and in some aspects of our shared life, lead them towards a vision of God's kingdom come, God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven? How do we move together towards a vision for a worshiping community that knows Jesus and grows in love? How do we do that in a way that acknowledges that we want a body of people that is growing with people of every age, race, gender, sexual orientation, socioeconomic situation, and political persuasion? How do we do that? Right? Not as like not as like a checklist of how we can become better, but just as an acknowledgement that we see the Holy Spirit moving us. How do we do that together? But I think this is the work, man. I mean, at least for me, inside the church. Like, we've talked a lot about what the church is supposed to do in the world, but there's also a lot of work on our community within. How do we take care of each other? And how do we move? And how do we allow ourselves to be moved by God? Right? This is part of the thing. And I don't doubt it. And I hope I didn't say anything that sounds like I am dismissive of your experience. I really hope that that's not the case, because I'm not at all. I think you're right. I think you say I've had so many experiences of quote unquote thin places with the poor that I truly feel Jesus there. Yes, just yes, unequivocally yes, absolutely yes. I think what's amazed me. So I have this book called 1001 Recordings You Must Hear Before You Die, or something like that, right? It's 1001 albums or songs or whatever from different people, and it's written by some jazz critic dude, and so there's way too much jazz in it, frankly. No one should listen to as much as this book suggests, but just kidding. But it's got music from all over the world and all different, since music has been recorded, all different times and eras throughout recorded music history. And it's pretty heavy on American music because it's written by an American and all that, but it's across the board and it's got all sorts of stuff. Anyways, why do I bring that up? I'll tell you why I bring that up. I bring that up because on the cover, it says, the more you love music, the more music you love, right? So when you really love music, you end up probably not just loving one genre. Now, you still might have a favorite, but you're going to be able to love music across this spectrum. The more you love music, the more music you love. And I would say the more you love people, the more people you love. And I would say the more you, I don't know how else to describe it, but like, the more you love Jesus, the more people you see Jesus in. The more you make an active intention of finding Jesus in this world, the more you will find Jesus. Not because you're painting this world with a Jesus brush so that everyone looks like Jesus, not so that you're making the world over so that it fits your mold, but because Jesus is indwelling in every person you meet. God's presence is real in this world. And we'll find Jesus wherever we look if we're serious and if we are seeking him. To seek Christ in all people. is our work, right? And Lisa, I appreciate it. The great thing about you trying to give it a shot and keep trying with church is you get a break right now, so you don't have to worry about attendance, and the way that you're involved can be on your terms. I mean, it always is anyway. It can be on anybody's terms, but I mean, it's even more so now, right? No one's going to be like, "Where were you?" Right now, you get to have that space. So I'm hoping that this is a gentle sort of reintroduction for you and maybe for others as well into what it might be to be part of this community or any community, frankly, of believers. Suggestion for something to read after Lamentations, which was scorchingly brutal. Well, what kind of thing do you want to read? Like, what do you want to feel? What are you feeling? What are you in the mood for? Right? And Betsy, while Lisa's responding to what is she in the mood for to read out of the Bible, Betsy, I say thank you. I knew you'd be here this morning, and that is like, I knew I'd get to see Betsy today, right? So that was such a joy for me, and I've always got that to look forward to on Tuesday mornings. I love that. And Lisa Clemens, I'm glad you were able to be here today. And Lisa Grubbs, I'm glad you were able to be here. Kathy was with us. We got a couple other people. I'm sure others will watch it later. I love that. So you're looking for love and you're looking for peace. Maybe a little romance. I mean, you could go for Song of Solomon. You could go for Song of Solomon and understand it and try to understand the theology, like try to see the romantic nature of our relationship with God. That could be a really interesting place for you to go, right? Song of Solomon could be good for your heart. There sure is a lot of darkness and heaviness in our Bible too. I might suggest I think Ephesians and Colossians are both pretty easy reads. There's some language in there about slaves obey your masters and wives obey your husbands. We can talk about that next week if you want. It's worth discussing why it's there, and what it. But I mean, frankly, at least for your sake, like just literally skip over that part because it's not the main purpose of the message that's in both of those books. Ephesians and Colossians are powerful in their articulation of the magnificence of God's love in the world in Jesus Christ. Just absolutely will knock your socks off, gobsmacking stuff in the best sense of the word, right? The book for prophets is scarily intense, and you may need to take it in waves, or you may need to step back from it. I mean, it is hard stuff. It is intellectually challenging, and it is spiritually challenging. So don't forget that. All right, I'm going to go. I've held you over an hour. Thank you. It's such a great way for me to it's a great way for me to, it's not start my day because I did start before this, but it is a great thing to have so early on in my week. And it's something I'm so looking forward to every week. So I'll see you all later. Come back next week, same time, and invite someone or get a question from people. If someone's not going to show up, be like, what kind of question would you want to ask a priest if you could? Ask someone that, and then shoot me a question, and we'll keep going. All right? All right. I'll talk to you all soon.